Aotearoa, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for the Thriving Cities webinar series. My name is Rachel Nepia. I'm the Program Manager for People, Cities and Nature, and I'll be your host for today. This webinar series explores what it means for cities in Aotearoa, New Zealand to create truly thriving biodiversity. Today's session is about one of our most fascinating and often overlooked city dwellers, urban lizards. We've got 3 speakers today that bring world-class expertise and deep passion to the subject. First today we'll hear from Chris Woolley, a postdoctoral fellow at Zealandia and Victoria University of Wellington. Chris is leading research on urban lizard conservation and monitoring in New Zealand. After Chris, we'll hear from Professor Nicky Nelson. Nicky is Te Wahanga Amanaya, Dean of Science and Engineering at Victoria University of Wellington. Her research on lizard ecology and evolution spans more than 2 decades. Today she'll be interviewing Diana Methner, who is a PhD student at Victoria, working on mitigation translocation outcomes for lizards in New Zealand. After Diana and Nicky, we'll have time for questions. So please use the Q&A function to ask your questions, and we'll get into as many as we can at the end. Okay, first up is Dr. Chris Woolley.
Yeah, cool. Chris Woolley tōku ingoa. I'm presenting today alongside Nicky Nelson and Diana Methner, as Rachel has said, talking about some of our research about urban lizards. And specifically today, we're going to talk about lizard management during land use change. I hope I can like this. Oh, there you go. Which is not something that's unique to urban settings, but it is something that certainly occurs in cities. And it sounds like there's a pretty diverse audience today, so I thought we'd start with just a little bit of context. And so Aotearoa has a particularly species-rich lizard fauna, and that's something that's sometimes quite underappreciated. We've got more than 120 lizard species in New Zealand in 2 families, skinks and geckos. And these species have evolved to live in a huge variety of environments, from forests, where arboreal species will live high up in the canopies of trees, and skinks will live amongst leaf litter, coastal habitats, high country grasslands, rocky tors. There's even alpine species that can survive under snow. But some of New Zealand's lizards also live in cities and in much more highly modified habitat. And this includes urban green spaces, residential backyards, agricultural land and forestry sites. And these sites often comprise exotic vegetation and can be pretty degraded and appear to have low ecological value. This last, the bottom right image shows a photo of a car seat headrest in a gully full of German ivy. Terrific habitat for northern grass skinks. It can be nice and warm in the sun. And species are found in these sorts of habitats in many parts of the country. So this map shows the distributions of 4 lizard species that are commonly encountered during land development. These species have wide distributions and include several main centres. A large number of New Zealand lizards are threatened. 97% are threatened or at risk. 2 species of geckos and 2 species of skinks are not threatened, so very, very few. Key threats are introduced predators, especially mammals, including the usual suspects, rats and mustelids, but also mice and hedgehogs, as well as habitat loss, both historical and ongoing due to land use change. And the effects of land use on lizard populations is increasingly being recognised. The graph on the left shows the dramatic increase in the number of Wildlife Act authorities issued for the purposes of lizard mitigation, or issued for the purpose of lizard and frog mitigation, herpetofauna mitigations. So a huge increase over the last 20 years. But while lizard populations are increasingly being considered and managed through development, just how this translates into outcomes for species conservation is largely unknown. And there are other wildlife species that are affected by development. Land snails face similar issues, as well as frogs and bats. But lizards are especially commonly and severely impacted because of their biology. As I've said, lizard species occur in habitats where development commonly takes place, and they're strongly associated with this habitat. They're usually unable to disperse away unless there's adjoining adjacent similar habitat. And on top of this, they're cryptic and secretive, and their distributions are not very well known, especially for example, in cities. So we've been exploring issues for the protection and management of lizards during land use, and I'm going to talk about some of the issues that result from policy before handing over to Nicky and Diana to talk about lizard mitigation practices. And we've recently written some of this up in a manuscript that's been accepted at New Zealand Journal of Ecology, which is open access. So if you're interested, you will soon be able to read more about it there. We've structured the presentation around 3 scenarios that can result when lizards are present during development. The first scenario is that lizards are overlooked entirely. The second is where lizards are considered and managed, but late in the development process. And lastly, where lizards are considered in the planning stages, but population outcomes are still uncertain. I'm going to talk about the first 2, and Nicky and Diana will discuss the third. So how lizards are managed during land use is governed by 2 pieces of law: the Wildlife Act, which tells us what we can and can't do with wildlife, and the Resource Management Act, which regulates the use of natural resources. And it's under the Wildlife Act that lizards are legally protected. They cannot be killed or their habitat disturbed without an authority from the Department of Conservation. However, in many cases of land use, lizards are never considered. In most cases, DOC, who administers the Wildlife Act, doesn't have any oversight over land use, and there's also little awareness of the implications of the Wildlife Act among those undertaking land use activities, because the risk of being prosecuted for killing or disturbing lizards is low. And this is because of the criminal nature of the Wildlife Act, which means that there's high thresholds for evidence and public interest that need to be satisfied in order for the Crown to prosecute. As a result, lizards or any wildlife that could be affected by development are most commonly first considered by councils under the Resource Management Act. Whether or not lizards are considered depends on the policies and rules of the council's district plan, and protection in these plans, which is often in the form of significant natural areas, SNAs, is informed by knowledge of where species and important habitat important ecosystems are present. For lizards, of course, this information is often lacking, and populations may be present in places that don't have protection, where councils are unable or unwilling to designate protection. So this map on the right shows the distribution of lizard records from the Department of Conservation herpetofauna database. The coloured orange and yellow points are records of lizards, and the green polygons you can see are the Wellington City Council's SNA network. And you can see that there's many places where lizard populations, even at risk species, are present outside these areas. In general zones outside of the SNAs, many land use activities that involve removal of habitat that could support lizards are permitted activities under plan rules, and therefore they don't require resource consent. So this is an example of a district plan, the rules from the general residential zone, and you can see that there's activities that are removing potential lizard habitat that are permitted. The top one shows indigenous vegetation, the bottom one exotic, and where an activity is permitted, no resource consent is required, and so there's no opportunity to consider biodiversity. The second scenario is the second scenario is when lizards are managed, but late in the process. And although this is difficult to quantify, this is something that we suspect might happen quite a bit. So this might occur when consent is granted without consideration of lizards, but a population is subsequently identified and a conscientious developer proactively seeks to gain a Wildlife Act authority, or when a project is granted reasonable consent with conditions that require lizard surveys, as opposed to this information being required as part of the application process. In these cases, there's often project delays with added expense to developers, and given the project is already underway, there's likely fewer options available for mitigating the effects on lizards. For example, avoiding the effects through redesign. So in these cases, lizard translocations are common. And to discuss the issues with mitigation translocation and the third scenario, which I suppose is the best case scenario, where lizards are considered and planned for early on, I'm going to hand over to Nicky and Diana.
Thanks, Chris. I'm assuming you can hear us. Thumbs up, please. Thank you. So welcome everybody, and thank you very much, Chris. Every time I hear you speak about this, I'm in a conundrum. It's very interesting and engaging, but also how did we end up here is my big question. However, I'm not going to go on with that. You've given me a job to do here, and that's to talk about what is happening to manage lizards. So the third scenario, especially where they intersect with land use change. Often we use the term salvage and translocations to refer to where steps are taken to manage the effects of land use change on lizards. So let's chat about that further. And with me, I've got Diana. Diana's a PhD candidate who is working in this area. And so the format for the rest of it is a Q&A between Diana and I that will hopefully inspire you as the audience to put some questions in our Q&A opportunity for our time at the end of the session. So Diana, salvage and translocations are commonly used to mitigate the effects of development on lizards. What does that typically involve?
Yeah, so a mitigation translocation typically involves taking individuals from a development site where they're going to be in harm's way due to some sort of activity and moving them to a site that is out of harm's way. This typically involves moving them hopefully somewhere where we have adequate habitat quality and we're able to move lizards there. If not, we often are performing some sort of habitat enhancement within those release sites. And then especially in New Zealand, we're doing some sort of predator control as well.
So many questions. Can you describe what these habitat enhancements look like, and what should be the goal of these movement actions we're calling translocations?
Yeah, so habitat enhancements, through the research that I've been performing, most commonly used in New Zealand involve creating some sort of rock or log pile that the lizards can be released into, or adding in some sort of native planting into the site to just kind of increase the habitat quality and theoretically increase the carrying capacity of the site as well. I think that the goal of a translocation, we should probably be kind of sticking with a conservation type translocation outcome. So we're hopefully looking for a no net loss of lizards as well as lizard habitat. So we really want to be using our best conservation practices when we're planning translocations and performing them. And then we really need to be recording our outcomes. So we need to record what we're doing, how we're doing it, and then we can kind of compare our methodologies so that we can figure out what works, and then we can continue developing our best practice in New Zealand. Unfortunately, since lizards are so cryptic, sometimes this can be really difficult, and there can be some pushback and just kind of, problems with planning these situations and performing those outcome monitoring. So there is a risk that the translocation goal becomes more about compliance and maybe kind of a tick box exercise rather than actually understanding outcomes. So we need to make sure that we are recording as much as possible so that we can develop that best practice and hopefully achieve the no net loss.
So no net loss is a little bit different to conservation gain, I'd like to point out. But anyway, I'll park that for a moment. You've alluded to quite a few issues. Would you like to describe them in a little bit more detail around the technique?
Yeah, so historically, herpetofauna are not ideal candidates for translocations. Like Chris mentioned before, they're very cryptic, hard to detect, long lifespans, low reproductive output. So this can make it really challenging to actually salvage all of the individuals from a site. Well, to initially identify them in the site, and then to salvage them all. And then that also makes it difficult to perform the outcome monitoring, because just because you don't find them in the release site after you've translocated them doesn't mean they haven't successfully established, they aren't reproducing. So it's a little bit hard to actually estimate our outcomes. And so without the ability to actually adequately monitor those outcomes and test the use of our enhancements in those sites, and just to make sure that the whole mitigation package is actually working, I think maybe we think we're doing better than doing nothing at all, but we're probably still not resulting in a no net loss of lizards and habitat. So there is still a negative impact of the development situation on those lizards and their habitat. And overall, it's probably it's a lot of time and effort and money that could be wasted if we're not using the best practices possible, and we aren't sure what really works.
Sounds like someone needs to do some research into these aspects. ...
Yeah, so through my thesis, I've been doing a review of some of the records from the Department of Conservation permissions database. And through this review, I've been quantifying kind of where translocations are occurring, what methods we're using, and trying to get closer to understanding our best practice. So far, I found that the results are a bit variable. So here, Chris has a map that I created of the permits that have been granted for lizard mitigation translocations across New Zealand from 2008 to 2024, which were all of the records that I had access to. So I'm just kind of seeing a lot of variation so far. There's a lot of areas where there's more translocations occurring than others. And then I've also found a lot of variation in the enhancements that we're using within our release sites as well. So rock and log piles and then native planting are all kind of the common threads, but I see a lot of variation in design and layout. So a log pile could be just a couple of log discs, it could be some sticks, or it could be large tree trunks and debris piles. And rock piles could be anywhere from a small pile of river stones all the way up to a huge, large boulder field. So there's a lot of things going on there to where we can't really compare what we're doing to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And building on from that review to kind of interpret some of those patterns I'm seeing, I have another chapter where I am conducting interviews to gather knowledge from lizard experts that are working within the translocation space. So I can kind of understand what's going on from more of the practitioner perspective, so that I can find some commonality in the issues that the practitioners are facing. And then hopefully from this review and from the interviews, we can recommend some realistic improvements to the process and maybe some of the policy, so that we can better benefit the lizards, their habitat, but also the people that are working within this space to hopefully make it a little bit more feasible.
And obviously you're doing a PhD, so there's other aspects of your thesis that we're not focusing so much on here, but would you like to just tell us a little bit about the full scope, what else you're contributing to and filling knowledge gaps, for example?
Yeah, so I'm trying to touch on a few different aspects of the whole translocation process. So looking through the review, interviewing practitioners, and then I'm also looking into some of those enhancements that we're using within the release sites. So I did perform an experiment where I was looking at the use of rock piles with lizards. So in this image we have on the left, we have an experiment that was performed in the lab by one of Nikki's former students, Kat McGee. So she was kind of looking at, a habitat choice experiment where lizards were fleeing to when you entered a room, and what they were using when there weren't, people in the room. And so what I've done is I've expanded on this, and I have done a field trial where I built these pens that you see on the right, and I'm putting lizards in there and then kind of assessing the use of grassy habitat versus rocky habitat in comparison with environmental variables for multiple species, to kind of see, if we can begin estimating, building evidence for the efficacy of these enhancements. And there has been some work done for, regarding the use of rock piles by lizards, by some other researchers. But I think we still just need to keep building that body of evidence to really prove that using rock piles is actually useful. And then another chapter of my thesis involves doing some species distribution modeling. So I'm modeling distribution of multiple species in the Wellington region. There was some work previously done by another one of Nikki's students, Eva Kessels, where she, you can see here, she did some distribution modeling of northern grass skinks in the Wellington region. So I'm building on this with multiple species in a much larger area across the Wellington region. And I'm trying to quantify the lizard distribution and then identify ideal areas for potential lizard translocation releases. So looking into what habitats might be, could be enhanced in the future for future translocations. Because I think that if we have an idea of where we can release these lizards ahead of time, we might be able to enhance them a little bit sooner and make sure that they're ideal candidates for releases. And then that will support DOC and councils and ecologists in planning translocations so that we have a better chance of studying outcomes by knowing what exactly is going on in the release site before we release lizards. And then we can understand how to make the translocations more successful and just kind of setting them up for success from the start.
Thanks, Diana. So we're managing lizards by permit in some areas of New Zealand, but apparently not in others. And that's likely not a direct function of there being no lizards in those areas. And the tools we're using, we don't have confidence work everywhere for no net loss or even gain for lizards. And we're aware this is not a lizard-specific thing, but also affects our other biodiversity, and particularly in cities, including native fish, frogs, bats, birds, and invertebrates, and to greater and lesser extents. The legal framework, the planning, and the practice are all involved in the situation we find ourselves in. But also there's a great deal of will to change by all parties. And I just wanted to take a moment, because I'm aware of our audience today, to say thank you to those of you in our audience who are involved in this area. Thank you for all your good work, for the care and the willingness to contribute to doing better in this space. And so on that note, I think it's probably a good place, Rachel, to break open to the Q&A from the wider team here. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nikki and Diana and Chris, for all your fabulous insights. Like you said, it's hard to see how we got here. How did we get here with our urban lizards, but really encouraging to see this work that's going ahead to make cities better places for our lizards. We've got a few questions here around monitoring. How do you detect lizards without harming them in their environment? Some people overseas use sticky traps. And then on the monitoring theme is another question tied to predator control. So monitoring lizards before and after predator control. Can you involve community members in this work, and how would you do it?
Okay, team, I'm going to take this one as a starting point, and you might just need to remind me of all the bits, Rachel. But, one of the big problems, one of the reasons we're in this situation is lizards are really cryptic. So when you go and look for them, you're probably not seeing most of them. If you go and look, you have to go and look at a time when you might expect them to be active. And so we generally aren't, unless we're in a salvage and we're doing, destructive habitat sampling, I would say we're generally relying on activity, which means they're out and about, which means the right temperatures, the looking in the right places for them. So it's really hard to know what's there. We have ecologists on this call, I know, who can provide a lot more commentary on how to find them and how to do your best to find as many as possible in salvage. But I'm absolutely confident we leave some behind. So then how do we find them after in a monitoring situation? Well, they could have scattered to the wind outside the habitat we put them in. And that's a classic for any kind of translocation, nothing specific about this particular situation at all. We have that problem in conservation translocations where they just could move out of where we're looking for them. So it takes an enormous amount of effort. to figure out what you have and how well you're doing. And the effort comes with another legislation around animal ethics for us that are in research. But there are some really strong guidance criteria or legal frameworks around how you can look for lizards, and not everyone is permitted to do some of those techniques. So sticky traps came up there. I believe MPI has some guidance around that being unethical in our country, to trap by sticky traps. I know that there have been sticky traps deployed for specific reasons, but it's not a common technique we would use in a translocation situation that I'm aware of. There might be others on the call who have used them, but
someone's asked if you could use tracking tunnels that you're already using to monitor for pests.
Yep.
Is that something you could do?
Yes, and that is used. They are used. I mean, again, there's so much variability in what's done around the country. I'm loath to provide all this. That's why I'm taking the heat on this. There's so much variability in how people are doing things, but yes, sticky traps are proving to be quite useful, multi-use tool for detection, not just of lizards, but potentially invertebrates too, but yeah, as well as for predators.
But I think the other big theme of questions there is around predator control. We've got a few people here looking to plan predator control, and how would you consider lizards when you're planning a predator control, when you're making a predator control plan?
Chris, are you going to show your face for this bit? Did you want to talk at all? You've been interacting more with the predator team. Have you got any comments on that? Because I kind of feel like I wanted to back out of that area, because that is absolutely not where I feel like I have commentary, but you have done some.
I don't have too much to say other than I think a lot of the predator control that's happening at the moment is perhaps the best evidence of success comes from bird responses, and so there's not, other than eradication, which has taken place on offshore islands, rat eradication or mouse eradication, and lizard responses to that in places where predators can be eradicated. There have been responses, but I think the best evidence shows that in order to see lizard responses, and it will vary by species as well, it's necessary to get rodent populations down to really low levels. And there's, I think, increasing evidence that mice are an issue. So I guess the recommendations would be to target the full suite of mammal predators and get them to as low levels as possible, which of course is what makes it really challenging.
Thanks, Chris. And that is about all the time that we have for questions today. Thank you so much for your questions. They've been really insightful. And kia ora to Nicky, Diana and Chris for sharing your knowledge and your experience with us today. Big thank you to everyone that joined the session. We hope that you're leaving with some fresh ideas about lizards, at least to have them ticking away in your mind when you're planning your projects and you're monitoring in your cities. If you would like to dive a bit deeper, we will follow up with links to the presenters' research and any of the resources that they'd like to share. And also keep an eye out on YouTube for the webinar recording if you'd like to go back. Our next webinar is in August, and we'll explore how urban wildlife responds to predator control. So if you're interested in predator control, definitely one to catch. Until then, kia pai tō rā, and all the best with your urban biodiversity work. Ka kite anō.
Rachel.